Next Pats podcast is presented by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more.
What's up, everybody? Welcome into the Next Pats podcast. I'm Phil Perry. We have an amazing episode lined up for you today, if I do say so myself. We have the great Mike Lombardi on with us this week to talk to us about all things Patriots draft. He's an incredible resource for us. You know that already if you're listening to this podcast, because A, he has been working alongside Bill Belichick since the early 90s when they were in Cleveland together and they were coming up with the grading system that the Patriots and other Patriots adjacent front offices still use today. And then Lombardi, of course, was recently in New England, serving as a Belichickian assistant, both for the coaching staff and in the front office, working all sorts of different projects for Bill Belichick, won a Super Bowl with the Patriots in 2014. Phenomenal resource for us. Mike has so much intel and so much insight that he can provide for us in terms of the thought processes that are involved on draft weekend. And that's what we picked his brain on in this episode of Next Pat. So we're throwing all sorts of questions at him in terms of why would they trade down here? Why not trade up here? Why would they go with one position over another? Need versus best player available. This conversation is chock full of Patriots thinking. Let's put it that way when it comes to the draft. So let's step inside to the Patriots war room. Let's go back to draft weekend. Let's try to put ourselves in Bill Belichick's shoes with his good friend, Mike Lombardi. Here's Mike. All right, there he is, Michael Lombardi. You know him, you love him, longtime NFL executive, the star of the GM Shuffle podcast, author, so many titles, Mike, but Patriots executive as well. It's great to have you here on Next Pats. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it.
So, Mike, I wanted to get you in after the draft. We do so much talking about the draft, leading up to the draft on this podcast. It starts months ago, really. And even during the season, we're talking about young players, rookie players. So we're all in on all things draft here. And I just want to ask you first and foremost, when you look at the Patriots draft this year, what does it tell you about how Bill Belichick sees his team going into 2023 and what he values going into 2023?
Well, I see a team that I see a draft that really is about team building. I see a draft that's about understanding who could be a free agent in 2024, who we might have to replace. I see a draft that put an emphasis on trying to win the offensive and defensive lines with the thought process and getting more speed on defense. So I think it pretty much played the way, Belichick visualizes most drafts, is to find young players to develop to replace older players that perhaps are going to make a lot of money in free agency.
So you're obviously a great resource for us here because you came up with Bill the grading system that the Patriots and now many other front offices, Patriots adjacent front offices, let's call them, are using. And you mentioned one thing there, you're thinking about the future. And we've heard Bill say that all the time. He has to build a team not just for this year, but for next year, the year after that, so on and so forth. But based on the grades, Mike, that the Patriots or any other of these teams will put together, how do they weigh we might have to start thinking about the future at center, for instance, versus the immediate need of, even if it's a position like kicker, the fourth round, the Patriots get an interior offensive lineman and then they trade up actually for a kicker. One might be viewed as a greater need in the here and now than the other, but how do you weigh those things against each other, the future versus the upcoming season?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the players in the draft, right? I mean, you can't invent things. And I think probably the Patriots went into this draft feeling like there were some down the road offensive linemen, especially with the interior, that they could perhaps get later on day three, as opposed to picking one on day one. I'm sure it would have been an option for them if they would have liked it. So I think one of the things you have to do a really good job of, and this is something I learned from Coach Walsh years ago, you got to scout inside out, not outside in. So you've got to know you have to grade your team. And you have to understand what your team's all about. And then once you grade your team, that determines your team needs, and then we also know age of players, when players' careers start to end. I mean, like I've said on my podcast, the grading system that Bill and I worked on in 1991 borrowed from the Cowboys system that goes back to the 60s. So there's no player that you're grading that hasn't been graded before. I mean, Anthony Richardson isn't an anomaly. He isn't the first great athlete that can run fast, jump high, and throw the ball 2 miles that has come through this. So there's a spot to put every player, because this is a long, long time.
And when you come up with these grades, Mike, and you're in the room on draft day, does scarcity of a certain position ever come into play? And might that ever supersede the grade? Meaning, hey, for example, we know it's not a great tackle class. And so if we wait too long, if we really need one, if it is one of our team needs, if we've determined that ahead of time, if we really need one, we might have to draft one relatively early. Would you ever be willing to do that and maybe draft that tackle, for this example, over a player at a different position that might not be as great a need, but that player might have a much better grade? Is that something that would factor into play?
Yeah, I think you get in a lot of trouble with that, right? So, here's the problem. You need a tackle, and you draft a tackle. And if he can't play good enough, you still need a tackle. The object of the draft is to satisfy the needs. So the player tells you if he can do that or not. The grade tells you if he can do that or not. The grade you assign him. So when you pick a player because he's the last of the tackles, let's say, and he's a 59 player, don't be mad at him because he doesn't play to the level you need him to play at. You graded him to a 59. You just got desperate. And I think that happens quite a bit. And I think what you probably saw in the first round with the Patriots was, yeah, there's a lot of guys that could have played offensive tackle. Maybe they weren't to the level that justifies the 14th pick in the draft, or the 15th, 16th, and then they ventured down to 17th. So the grade tells you can't manufacture players. I think we saw that in this draft. Everybody wanted this to be a 5 quarterback draft. I think it's a 1 quarterback draft. And my grades would have reflected 1 quarterback draft. Other teams didn't.
Did you ever buy the Patriots' interest in Will Levis, Mike? That was a big topic of conversation here. They brought him in for a visit, which I get. You're trying to do your due diligence. You're trying to find out about all these guys. But it didn't seem like, based on what, Bill appears to have drafted or valued at that position in the draft and elsewhere in the past, I'm not sure it married up with who Will Levis is. So were you buying their interest in him?
Well, I think that I'm buying their research in him, and certainly he determines where they go. But I think, to me, if you understand player development, we know Mac had a really good rookie year. He did not play well last year. Last year doesn't override the rookie year, nor does the rookie year override the bad year. So I think Bill's very patient. Bill comes from the Carpenter rule, measure twice, cut once. And I think, to me, knowing that about Bill, which, he never really told me, but knowing that about Bill, the way he's behaved during his Hall of Fame career, lends you to believe that he was going to be more patient than just quick twitch and just make a decision. So, the Levis thing, I think they probably had a sense that Levis wasn't going to go as early as most of the mock drafters thought he was going to go.
I wanted to ask you too, you just mentioned, the first round, obviously they trade down. Can you just give us a little refresher on when that happens? Is that because there's a cluster of players that are essentially graded relatively similarly? And so the team is happy with any number of those guys. And so you make that move down and you just hope and you assume that one of them will be there for you. Is that essentially the thought process for a trade down, Mike?
I think when you trade down, you're trading to a cluster. You're not trading to a player. If we go down from 14 to 17, we're going to get one of these guys. They're all the same grade, and we're going to pick up an extra pick. And that extra pick could end up being the kicker, could end up being an offensive guard. It could be somebody else, So, it's Gonzalez, and whoever they picked in the 4th round for that pick is really what they got for 14. So you have to look at it that way. So you trade down, and if you trade down and you only have a guy in mind, then you shouldn't trade down, because you're trading out of a group. If, say, you have an elite player at 7-0 at 14, you better take him, because if you trade to 17, he's probably not going to be there.
And you can't know, right? Even if you have a pretty good idea of what the teams that you are now jumping behind are looking for, the pro scouting department, I know, does their research on that and has an idea of what they might be looking for. You can't know for sure, right? And you can't know that, maybe one of those teams makes a trade, and now all of a sudden a different kind of player goes off the board while you're waiting to pick. Is that fair?
I think that's really fair. I think you see it, I think the Patriots probably saw it in their draft. I'm sure there were a lot of people that wanted to get the kid from Sacramento in the third round, that they were trying to trade up in front of them that couldn't get there. And White was a kid that a lot of people thought was going to go late in the first round. And, there he lingers into the fourth. So, yeah, a lot of it takes some luck, but you got to know what you're trying to get to. And then you're trying to trade up and you can't trade up. You're trying to get to the guy and you can't get to him because other people are trying to move into it.
Yeah, the White pick was really interesting because I know he was in consideration for them in the first round, and he ends up getting all the way to 46. Is that a scenario where you'd probably love to trade up to make sure you get him if you could?
If you could, but sometimes you can't. Everybody thinks they got their guy. They have to pick their guy, and then, all of a sudden, what makes a trade competition, right? So if you got 3 teams on the phone, the chart doesn't really matter anymore. Like, look, it's going to take this to get him. How bad do you want him? And then I think that's what happens. And so, you're trying to trade up, but I think the Patriots had a really good understanding of the middle of the draft, and they wanted to make sure they came away with players that they felt could impact their team. Remember, the draft is really about the 24 team, not necessarily the 23 team. You're setting yourself up for 24. Now, some of these kids may come in and really make a huge difference. I expect Gonzalez to play right away, and White too. But in terms of their dominance in the league or their ability to ascend to their level, it usually is in the second season.
Which makes a lot of sense in terms of some of the positions they drafted, as you mentioned, with the interior offensive line. Who knows what the future holds for David Andrews or Mike Owenu is going into the last year of his contract. They have some edge players that are going to be up soon. So Keon White in the second round, might not have looked like an immediate need necessarily, but a player obviously that they valued and will look like a need, I think, very soon here. I wanted to ask you about the trading again, Mike, here, because there was an interesting scenario that played out in the first round. I'm sure you noticed, but the Patriots, with the Aaron Rodgers trade being what it was, the Jets end up behind the Patriots instead of ahead of the Patriots at number 13. The Patriots trade back with the Steelers. They take the tackle that everybody thinks the Jets want. So I put it to you, would there have been added value in the Patriots maybe understanding that the Steelers would want to take the guy that the Jets wanted? Do you see that maybe being a factor in that move?
I think this is really more about the Steelers and the Jets than the Patriots and the Jets. I think the Steelers knew the Jets were probably thinking offensive linemen, and they made the deal and they got ahead of them. I don't think the Patriots really cared about moving behind the Jets. I think it was the deal. Now, people say, well, they should have got a third for it. Well, a lot of it is based on where you want to go, and do you feel like you have value when you move down? So, look, the Jets probably, would they have taken Jones? I'm sure they would have. They needed a tackle. It took them a long time on the clock to come up with their pick, right? The Iowa State kid. So, for me, a lot of this is controlled by Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh kind of had a pretty well sense that the Jets were going to take a tackle, and the Jets should have known that Pittsburgh was going to take a tackle too. The Jets should have probably been on the phone with New England.
Right. They made a trade later in the draft. They've made trades the last couple of years in the draft.
When you're in the draft, there really is no opponent in the draft. It's slots. You can, does it matter if you trade with Atlanta or you trade with the Miami? I mean, they're slots. They're not. And remember, the players, the picks become players. We all judge the trades. We all judge it's not where they go, it's how they play.
That was a fun little interaction. Even Matt Groh he looked like the cat who swallowed the canary when we asked him about it after the fact. Hey, was there any added benefit in maybe, having the Jets lose their guy by trading with the Steelers there? So even if it wasn't there necessarily at the forefront of their thought process, it seemed like, at least Matt enjoyed that maybe people were implying that could have been.
Yeah, I mean, if you're Joe Douglas and the last tackle is Broderick Jones and you saw Skronsky go, you saw everybody go. I mean, we saw Jacksonville later in the draft because they needed a tackle, even though they were trading down in the first. They traded up to get Harrison because they knew he was the last legitimate, perhaps right tackle in the draft.
Mike, the last thing I wanted to ask you as far as the draft goes, because I think people were, fans and media, I'll lump myself in here too, being who we are, receiver is a sexy position, right? That everybody's focused on. And the Patriots ended up getting 2. I think they're both actually really interesting players, but they waited until the 6th round to get one, right? When the Patriots are looking at the draft and they're looking at a position like receiver, how does the current roster come into play in terms of determining whether or not a player is worthy of a pick? You talked about, these draft picks being for more of the 2024 team and beyond. but they're also looking at their current depth chart too, right? And saying, can rookie X beat out, veteran receiver number 4, for instance? Is that sort of the logic that's at play there?
Look, what you don't want to do is just improve a little bit. Do you want to draft somebody in the first round who's graded slightly higher than somebody you have on your team? That's probably not a smart thing to do. Everybody confuses new with good. Like, he's the new receiver, so he must be better than the old. Like, Thornton can take a step forward. They're going to need him to make a huge jump, and I think he can, with his speed and his toughness, the way he showed. So, it's funny. Walsh used to say this all the time. This notion about, I love reading this. The Patriots did nothing to help Mac Jones in this draft. They drafted 3 offensive linemen. Doesn't that help Mac Jones? Like, this is how bizarre we've come in football. We just come off the Super Bowl where everybody's praising the Eagles for their offensive and defensive line acumen. And then we get in the draft and everybody says, well, you got to draft more receivers. Well, yeah, the Eagles drafted, they got Waddle, they got Smith, and then they got, they traded for AJ Brown. But to me, it's about the lineman. That helps the quarterback more than anything. Ask Tom Brady, would you rather have a great left tackle or a receiver? And he's like, I need the tackle. I need protection. So I think the young receivers on the Patriots are going to have to grow and develop. And the 2 kids they drafted have a chance. Bote was a kid that a lot of people thought could get drafted in the 2nd or 3rd round a year ago, before whatever happened at LSU happened.
Right. I think there's a really good chance that one of those guys ends up making the roster, and who knows, maybe both. If there's an injury or there's some sort of roster move that happens at that position, I really actually like both of those players. It'll be fun to see how they work out. Mike, this has been great. Thanks so much for teaching us about the draft.
Thanks, Phil. Appreciate it.
The NBA playoffs are here, and you can turn crossovers into cash with FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com/NBCSB right now and place a $5 bet, and you'll get an instant $150 in bonus bets. That's win or lose. FanDuel is so easy to use. You're going to see great promotions there every single day. The app is safe and secure, and you're going to get paid instantly, which you will love. There's no better place to bet all the playoff action than America's #1 sports book. Just go to FanDuel.com/NBCSB and sign up to get $150 in bonus bets when you bet your first $5. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA.
Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Hope is here. GamblingHelplineMA.org or call 800-327-5050 for 24/7 support. Massachusetts. Call 1-877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 New York. 21 plus and present in select states. FanDuel is offering online sports wagering in Kansas under an agreement with Kansas Star Casino LLC. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable bonus bets that expire 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit FanDuel.com/RG in Colorado, Iowa, Michigan, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Tennessee, or Virginia. 1-800-NEXT-STEP or text NEXT-STEP to 53342 in Arizona. 1-888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org/chat in Connecticut. 1-800-9-WITH-IT in Indiana. 1-800-522-4700 or visit ksgamblinghelp.com in Kansas. 1-877-770-STOP in Louisiana. Visit www.mdgamblinghelp.org in Maryland. 1-800-522-4700 in Wyoming or visit www.1800gambler.net in West Virginia.
Man, there's just so much meat on the bone when we're able to talk to Mike. Thanks so much to him for spending so much time with us this week. There are so many topics here that we can dig into. And let's start right off the top of our conversation when he talked about this draft being about preparing for the future. And ostensibly, that's what every single draft should be, right? I think the Patriots are in a really interesting spot in terms of their organizational trajectory right now, where they have to be good in 2023. The owner is demanding it. And if they run it back with another 8-9 season, for instance, what does that mean for the organization? What does that mean for Bill Belichick? What does it mean for Mac Jones? How many changes would be made if that were the case? So drafting for the future is what you have to do. It's what you should do. The Patriots maybe got themselves in trouble by not doing that and doing it more effectively, more often for a stretch of time where it felt like they went several years without contributing high-end draft picks. So how is this a preparing for the future kind of draft? Again, when you would think that they would need help in the here and now. Well, look at some of the positions they drafted. Look at Keon White as an edge defender. To me, talking to coaches around the league who scouted him, who interviewed him, the name that comes up in terms of the player on the Patriots roster whose role he could fit would be Dietrich Wise. Now, Dietrich Wise is obviously still under contract. And not only is he under contract for 2023, he's under contract for 2024. But maybe by the time you get to 2024, you're ready to move on because Wise has gotten up there in terms of age and you want a younger, bigger in terms of weight and maybe more explosive in terms of athleticism option in your second round pick from 2023. And so maybe he takes on, Keon White takes on a bigger role in year 2 in 2024 to get to Mike's point. How about Marte Mapu? He seems like an obvious fit for that strong safety role if Kyle Duggar is no longer with the Patriots in 2024. This is the last year of his rookie deal, 2023. So maybe you have your strong safety of the future there. Maybe you have your center of the future in Jake Andrews. Maybe he eventually steps in for David Andrews, who is signed through 2024 as well. Chad Ryland, okay, he's your 4th round pick. We don't usually talk about kickers on this podcast, but you're going to need a succession plan for Nick Folk, given that he is closer to the end than the beginning. So really interesting that this would be a plan for the future draft, again, which it should be, but interesting given where the Patriots are and the amount of immediate help it seems like they will need in order to truly contend in the AFC, which is going to be the stronger of the two conferences, in my opinion. Also interesting to hear Mike talk about scouting from inside out. And it feels like that's something Bill Belichick has done for a long, long time. It feels like the closer you get to the football, that's where he's been really good. Interior offensive lineman, interior defensive lineman. It's not only where he's been good, it's where he's wanted to invest. You look at the number of first-round picks over the years that are defensive tackles or offensive linemen. This is where Bill Belichick wants to be strongest, both literally and figuratively. He knows that he plays in New England. He knows that his team's going to have 10 or so bad weather games, and you're going to have to run the football. Even in 2023, he wants to be tough in the trenches. And so scouting from inside out, and specifically on the offensive line, look at all those interior players there. When you talk about Jake Andrews, when you talk about Sidi Sow, and you talk about Antonio Mafi, all three. Andrews looks like maybe he's even a center-specific player, but a center guard sort of versatile option, whereas Sow might be a guard tackle versatile option. Mafi looks like he might be a guard only option, but really interesting to see how those pieces all fit in. And to get back to Mike's original point about preparing for the future, Mike Owenu, another player going into the final year of his contract, just like Kyle Duggar. And so you're going to need a succession plan there if you can't keep him around. But especially with Mac Jones, building from inside out on the interior of the offensive line makes so much sense because he's a pocket passer. And so how is a pocket passer going to avoid pressure typically? Well, it's a little easier for those pocket passers. We saw it with Tom Brady for decades. It's easier for those players to be able to avoid pressure coming off the edge, because if the interior is stout, then you'll have room to step up and deliver the football. That pressure from the interior is the pressure that you really can't get away from. If you're Tom Brady, Mac Jones, Drew Brees, Phillip Rivers, Eli Manning, Peyton Manning, name your pocket passer, that interior pressure is essentially death. And it used to be that, right? It used to be the great retort to anyone who said that the way to beat Tom Brady is to pressure him from the interior. The great retort to that was always, yeah, genius. It's actually death for any quarterback. Any quarterback has a hard time dealing with interior pressure. And that is true to an extent. But in today's game, with the athletes that we're seeing now, Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert, Kyler Murray, those types of athletes, how often do you see them spin away from interior pressure, roll out to their left or their right, and either create yards with their legs or throw on the run for an explosive game? Interior pressure isn't always the end of the play in 2023. So you have to be a special kind of athlete, though, to make sure that's the case. That's not what the Patriots have at that position right now. So you have to make sure you're solid on the interior. And with the picks they've made, I think Bill Belichick probably feels better about the fact that his team will be solid on the interior, not only this year, but in the next 2, 3, 4 years. And then we get into the conversation about the grades right? The grades, they mean so much to the Patriots. I'm sure to the Texans. I'm sure to the Cardinals. I'm sure to any Patriots affiliated front office. Throw the Raiders in there as well. It matters to all teams, right? Months and months and months of work go into these grades. And so you don't want to abandon them on draft weekend just because you get stuck at a certain position. Well, we really would have loved to take a tackle here. But to Mike's point, so you got stuck and you needed a tackle, so you took a backup tackle when you really needed a starter. How's that helping you? It's not. And so that to me explains why you see the Patriots avoid tackles early in this year's draft. I think it's why you see the Patriots avoid receivers early in this year's draft. And part of that conversation too, and I'm glad Mike got into this, is how you have to grade against what you already have, right? So if you have Trent Brown and Riley Reiff graded as starters, flawed as they may be, if they're graded as starters and Calvin Anderson is graded as something just slightly behind that, but an NFL player and someone who could contribute, the way the Patriots grading system works is you can look up at the board, see a number, maybe see a letter or two or three, and you can understand what that player means to your team right now and compare that against a player in this year's draft. And if Trent Brown grades out as a starter and he's a 6'3", call it, just plucking a number, but that in the Patriots system would be somebody who could start. If he's a 6'3" and the best option you have in the draft, after you took Christian Gonzalez in the first round, you took Keon White in the second round, and you're feeling good about where you're at, and all the tackles left are 5'9" and below, well, is it really worthwhile for you to invest in that position? Because you're not improving your roster. Again, according to the grades. We can disagree on certain players and how they should have been graded. You know, somebody like, he's become my guy, I guess. I had him drafted to the Patriots in last week's episode where we did my version of the Patriots draft, or I had them taking Carter Warren out of Pitt. I think he's somebody who could potentially start someday. That would have been worthy to me of a fourth round investment. You know, they take Sidney Sal in the fourth round. Maybe they see him as a future tackle. Maybe they have him graded as a tackle with that in mind. I'm sure somewhere on his grade, it's been determined that he can play multiple positions, and the grade would reflect that. But maybe that's why they feel good about taking him, and they feel good about their chances at tackle now because he's part of the mix. Not that he'll start this year, but that he has that potential. But the grading against the current roster, to me, is a really key point, because especially at receiver, you know, Jackson Smith and Jigba, I can tell you, is somebody that they just did not view as explosive enough to help their team. So you're going to spend a first round pick on that guy when you're looking at Kendrick Bourne's grade or Juju Smith-Schuster's grade, and you're saying, we're going to have to spend a first round pick on this player, and he's not really making a noticeable improvement for our roster grade wise on anybody that we have currently on the roster. Why would we go ahead and do that? So I think it's just good for Mike to bring us back to center when it comes to understanding some of the things that we already know and things that we've spoken about on this podcast when it comes to the grades. I just want to read a quick excerpt from my friend Michael Hawley's book, Patriot Reign. I'm sure many of you have been able to read it. If you haven't and you're listening to this podcast, go buy it, hard copy, Kindle, whatever you got to do, and read it as soon as you can, because it's phenomenal work by Michael. And there's so much insight when it comes to the draft. I'm just going to read a quick excerpt here. And he's following Jason Light, who's now the general manager for the Tampa Bay Bucks, obviously. And this is 2002, October of 2002. He gets pulled into Bill Belichick's office to talk about a few guys, quote unquote. 50 players later, Jason Light and Bill Belichick are still talking. And here's the quote from Light. He says, and then while you're talking, he, meaning Belichick, is typing notes into his computer. And he'll say, yeah, I saw this guy versus Penn State. He's just kind of flopping around. I don't think that's our type of guy. Now here's Hawley. Our kind of guy is someone who can be quantified, says Hawley. The Patriots grading system for players has its own music and melody. It is the marriage of science and art, instinct and intellect. There is a New England alphabet and New England numerology. Every player who puts on a silver helmet is defined in these terms. And then he gets into the terms. And he talks about how there are lowercase letters that will be associated with these grades. There are uppercase letters that will be associated with these grades. He talks about the three major categories by which a player is graded. And he gets into the numbers. So let's just do a quick breakdown here. It's a fun little exercise because I want to break some of these down for you. We've done this on the podcast before. We'll try to do that quickly. And then we'll do a few example grades for players that were in this year's draft class. And we can talk through some of the scenarios that we saw play out on draft weekend. So there's all sorts of letters associated with these grades, right? Let's start with the lowercase letters. So lowercase a would mean that a player has an age concern. Lowercase c is for character. Lowercase x is for injury. T means you're going to be a special teams contributor. TT means you're a special teams specialist. You're so good in the kicking game that you make the roster on that ability alone. That's your Matthew Slaters. Or one player in this year's draft class who we'll get into. Weight. If you have a weight problem, you're going to have a lowercase w next to your name. A lowercase L means you played a lower level of competition. A Y, lowercase y means you were a transfer. Then there are the uppercase letters. An A or an A plus, you know what that means. Pretty self-explanatory. You think that guy's a great player. You think he has a chance to be a Hall of Fame level player. A Q might mean he's a little short. A capital C might mean there's some sort of circumstance that led to a lack of production. Could be anything. An uppercase P means that player is a projection because he's going to be playing a position that he did not play in college. An uppercase S, you've got a speed problem. An uppercase B, Holly explained, means you're bulk deficient. Bulk deficient based on your weight. That guy weighs 250 pounds, but it looks like he hasn't worked out on a leg day since he got to campus. Okay, that might lead to an uppercase B. And then an uppercase I equals clean from a height, weight, speed perspective. And then there are three categories that really help decide your number grade, right? There are major factors. The major factors are factors that every single player across positions is graded on. Your behavior, your athletic ability, your strength and explosion, your competitiveness, your toughness, your ability to process your mental/learning, and your injury situation. Those 7, every player gets graded on. Then there are critical factors that are dependent upon your position, and there are position skills, which obviously are dependent upon your position as well. But all of those get baked into your number grade. You have your letters associated with that number grade, and you have your overall grade. And just to get into some of the numbers, in terms of what that means for someone's grade, the grading scale goes from 1 to 9. So if you're a 9 or you're a 9+, you're a Hall of Fame caliber player. You're an all-pro, perennial all-pro kind of player. If you are an 8 or above, you're going to be a starter. You're someone who will start in the NFL in his first year. If you're a 7, between a 7 and a 7.99, you're someone who should start in his first year, but might have an issue that would suggest that you shouldn't. But you should be a starter. That's your circumstantial starter category, 7 to 7.99. Then, if you're a 6.5 to a 6.99, you're a make it plus player. That means somebody who won't necessarily start in year 1, but will contribute and is expected to become a starter. That number is going to come up for a 6.5 in that 6.5-ish range. It's going to come up with one of these Patriots picks this year when we do our presumed grades, or when we do our guesstimate grades. We'll call them that a little bit later. Then there's a dirty starter. Love that name. Dirty starter is a 6 to a 6.49. That's somebody who could start, but has an issue. Either you're a talented underachiever or you're a not so talented overachiever. Maybe you've got a speed limitation that prevents you from being a lockdown starter, but that's your dirty starter category, 6 to 6.49. Then you're in the make it category. If you are a 5.5 to a 5.99, that's somebody who's going to make the roster, but probably not going to be an impact player. Then your free agent category is your 5 to your 5-4-9. That's somebody who's not expected to make the team, but maybe as a practice squad player, maybe somebody you could develop. Then there's a Pat's reject, which is the 7th category here, 4-9 to 4-9-9. That means somebody who is just slightly under the standards to meet the Patriots criteria and be a pick for them. But maybe he meets the standards for someone else and he ends up on another roster. And then there are your rejects. That's your 1.00, doesn't belong in the NFL. So let's put it all together and let's talk about some of the players in this year's class. And I find this especially interesting because the Patriots ended up trading down in the first round, meaning, again, getting back to Mike's point from our conversation, you're trading down for the cluster. You're looking at your board, you see a variety of players that essentially have the same grade. You're making a determination there and you're saying to yourselves, we'd be okay missing out as long as we get one of these guys from this group, wherever we end up trading down to. So the Patriots had to be comfortable with losing Christian Gonzalez. We've said that on the podcast before. They had to be. They couldn't know for sure that they were going to get him. Maybe they felt pretty good. They knew a tackle was going to go at 14 to the Steelers. They knew the Jets maybe weren't going to take a corner. But the Commanders took a corner. They couldn't have known for sure that Washington was not going to go with Christian Gonzalez. So they make that trade down and they're comfortable with whoever they're left with. Turns out they were left with multiple options still at 17, because I know they were considering Keon White at 14 overall, along with Christian Gonzalez. So what might their grades have been? Again, this is a guess by me. I don't know what their grades were, but my guess is that both Christian Gonzalez and Keon White, and maybe another player or two, it's my understanding that they were looking at non-corners outside of Gonzalez. So they had Gonzalez and Devin Witherspoon at the top of their board at that corner spot. So they weren't necessarily looking at Gonzalez or, for instance, Deontay Banks, who I really liked through the process and I thought was a great fit for the Patriots. But he didn't measure up with Gonzalez or Witherspoon for that matter. So he wouldn't have been in the conversation at 14. But Gonzalez, Keon White, I have reason to believe that Nolan Smith might have been in that category as well. Although none of these guys perfect players. So none of these guys are going to be 9s, right? Perennial all-pro, potential Hall of Fame types of players. If that player makes it to you at 14 overall, you're taking that player. But my guess is, and again, we're guessing. Let's call them all 7.5s. Those 3 players, Christian Gonzalez, Keon White, Nolan Smith. Let's call them 7.5s. What would that make them in the Patriots grading system? That would be the second category. That would be circumstantial starter. Someone who should start in the NFL in his first year, but might have an issue that would lead to them not starting. Now, for Gonzalez, we talked about this on last week's podcast. That might be his level of physicality. Maybe it's the production period from Christian Gonzalez. You know, relative to some of the other corners in this class, it wasn't like he had the best passer rating against, for instance, or the most interceptions. He is a projection, not in that he would have a capital P next to his name because he'd be asked to play a position that he didn't play in college. That's not the case, but he's a little bit of a projection based on he is a tremendous athlete and he has all the skills in the world to be able to become a lockdown corner. It just wasn't that way consistently through his college career. Plenty of great examples of him being a lockdown guy on tape. Not as necessarily consistent as somebody like, again, from the same draft class, as somebody like Witherspoon from a production standpoint. So Gonzalez, again, the guessing grade here for me would be something like 7.50. So somebody who should start, and maybe he would have a capital C with his name as well, which would be some sort of circumstance that led to lower production. Maybe that's how the team would be able to keep itself aware of his physical profile. Or maybe that would just be shorthand for them to be able to remember, okay, 4 picks in college. He also would probably have an eye for clean height, weight, speed type of guy. I mean, he's a phenomenal athlete. So he might have an eye next to that 7.5 and he'd have a Y as a transfer player, right? Transfer from Colorado to Oregon. So Maybe it's something like C750IY for Christian Gonzalez. Whereas for Keon White, it's 750AWY. The A would be for age. He's already 24. That might be a little bit of a quote unquote age concern for them. The W might be for weight, honestly. This is somebody who, it's my understanding, played at upwards of 290 pounds at times in school. That's a little big for the Patriots on the edge. If that's where they want him to play, they might have that W next to his grade. And then the Y, again, he's a transfer as well from Old Dominion. So 750AWY. Now, Nolan Smith might be 750WX. Okay, so again, should be a starter year one. I think he could play on the edge. He could probably play off the ball if you really wanted him to. He's that athletic. This guy is a freaky athlete. The W would be because he's in the 230s, whereas I think the Patriots, in terms of their edge defenders, they would like them in the 250 or above range. So maybe you'd have a W there in terms of being a little too light. And the X would be there because he injured his pec last year, and that would have limited his production. So you're looking at all these grades and you're factoring in the letters and you're saying, okay, let's move down and we'll end up with one of these guys. And they ended up with two. Now, somebody like Deonte Banks, maybe he's just not viewed as quite the same level player in terms of his number grade. So maybe his number grade is maybe it's a 7.3, maybe it's a 7.25, maybe it's a 7.0. And there's an X there because he dealt with a shoulder injury. And so that's something that they're contending with. Or Broderick Jones, the tackle from Georgia. Maybe he's a 7.25. Somebody who should start, but there might be a lowercase c next to his grade. Because in terms of his football character, it's my understanding, you might be dealing with some immaturity there. Maybe a little bit of work ethic kind of issue at the next level. Now we'll see. Maybe he'll have no issues at all in Pittsburgh for Mike Tomlin. But that's something that I had heard about him. And so maybe that would show up in his grade in New England. And somebody like Jackson Smith-Njigba, who we just talked about, he might not be in the sevens for them. He might be more of a 6'4"-ish player. He might be a dirty starter, somebody who could start, especially in today's NFL. You're starting three receivers a lot of the time. So he might be a number 2 or number 3, but he's got a speed limitation that wouldn't necessarily make him a lock starter or even a circumstantial, a 7+ guy starter for the Patriots. Again, that's a guess by me. But that's how I know they viewed him, was not necessarily explosive enough to warrant that consideration in the middle of the first round. So his grade might be 7.40 SCX. So the speed deficient part of it shows up with the S. The uppercase C, he had a circumstantial production issue in college because he missed a lot of time with a hamstring injury. And so the hamstring shows up in the X. I mean, maybe that's an injury issue that they would flag in that way. So that to me is sort of a fun way to look at, okay, all the players that might have been involved in that first round conversation, who really is in the conversation. Okay, well, if we're talking about a 7.3 versus a 7.5, get the 7.3s out. Let's just think about the 7.5s. If you're talking about a 6.4, then of course we're not going to think about him in the first half of the first round. How about a little bit later in the draft? Some of these players that the Patriots ended up selecting, what their grades might have been. Somebody like Marte Mapu would have an interesting grade to me because he would have that uppercase P to me. He's sort of a nickel defender, slot defender in some ways in the college game. The college game is so much different than the Patriots and the rest of the NFL, what they're doing at the pro level defensively, especially. So he might have a P because he's going to be asked to play as a linebacker at times and a strong safety and maybe even a deep safety at times. And it would be used in a variety of ways, and there would be some overlap from college, but it would be different. So you might have the P there with Marte Mapu's grade, and maybe he would be a 6.5. Maybe he would be a make it plus kind of player, right? Okay, so 6.5, what are you talking about there? Won't start in year one, but will contribute and is expected to become a starter. So if he's drafted to maybe replace Kyle Duggar one day or Adrian Phillips or Jabril Peppers, maybe he doesn't start this year, especially he's dealing with injury too. And we'll get to that in the grade. He's dealing with injury, but he could start in year 2. So he's a make it plus guy. You're expecting him to contribute along the way. So maybe the grade for him would be something like P650T for special teams, X, because he's dealing with an injury as well. He obviously tore his pec at the Senior Bowl. So P650TX. That feels like a feels like a grade for Marte Mapu. Oh, you'd have the L in there as well for lower level competition. Can't forget that. Man, it's alphabet soup here now. P650 TLX. Again, that's a really interesting one to me. How about Kayshon Boutte? To me, he'd have an S with his name because I think there are some speed concerns for him right now. He looks like a slot receiver, somebody who finds the holes in zones. I think you can find on his tape plenty of examples of him outrunning players like Emmanuel Forbes, who ran a 4.3 for a long touchdown. But the testing is very odd in terms of his overall athleticism, not as fast as he's shown at times on tape. So you might at least have the letter S up there just to make you aware of the fact that you have some questions about his speed. And maybe he's a 600 kind of player. So he's sort of a dirty starter because he could start. A lot of people thought he could start just a year ago, maybe be more than that. But he has issues. That's how it's described here in Hawley's book. So he could either be a talented underachiever, which I think is probably safe considering what he did 2 years ago at LSU, or an overachiever. Again, to me, he would be the former rather than the latter in this circumstance. So he'd be sort of an S600 XC kind of player in terms of lowercase x, lowercase c. You got your injury X there, and you've got your football character concern, and represented by the lowercase c. That's how I would suspect Boutte is maybe labeled for the Patriots. Again, just guessing here. How about Amir Speed? This is an interesting one for me because he might be a 550 TTY guy. This genuinely sounds like AIM speak now, for those of you who are familiar with Instant Messenger. So you're talking about 550. That's a make-it player, will make the roster, but won't win or lose a game for you. Won't necessarily be an impact guy. But I think he will make the roster as a special teamer. And that's why the TT is there. So 1 T for being able to contribute on special teams, 2 T's for being a core special teamer, and that being your primary role with the team. And he's got a Y in here as well because he's a transfer player too. So he goes from Georgia to Michigan State. Maybe they just have to get rid of the Y's altogether for the Patriots grading system because there are going to be so many transfers. There already are, but there are going to be even more with all of the rules now that exist in the NCAA. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Next Pats podcast. Hopefully, didn't give anyone an ice cream headache with all of those letters and numbers, but I find that stuff really, really interesting, especially when it comes to the draft day decisions. Why not take a receiver or a tackle earlier than they did? Well, because the grades suggested that wasn't wise. Based on the grades alone in a vacuum, okay, this player might not be worthy of the number 14 overall pick, call it. This guy might not be a true starter in our top overall category when it comes to our grades, or even a circumstantial starter. He might be a dirty starter. And is that what we want to do at 14 overall? Don't you want something a little bit safer than that? And then there are the grades that are on your roster already. So look, you got to look at Trent Brown's grade. You got to look at Riley Reif's grade. You got to look at Calvin Anderson's grade and Connor McDermott's grade. Does it make sense? Are we really improving? Are we really upgrading? Whereas somebody like, Christian Gonzalez, I think does give you a real obvious upgrade and is a quote unquote clean prospect at a position that was also a position of need. So tackle can be a position of need, receiver can be a position of need, but if the grades of the players available and the grades of the players already on your roster don't marry up in a certain way, it's not going to make sense to you to draft that position early. All right, thanks again to Mike Lombardi for joining us here on Next Pats. Always great to get a chance to pick his brain about what the Patriots are doing and why. Thanks to you for listening to this week's episode. We've got more great interviews coming at you, so make sure you're keeping an eye out for our next Pats episode. We're going to be talking to Executive Director of the Senior Bowl, Jim Nagy. The Patriots took 5 Senior Bowlers every single year. They are loading up on Senior Bowlers, it feels like. Jim Nagy obviously has some experience, in the Patriots front office as well. So we get Mike Lombardi one week, former Patriots scout, Jim Nagy next week. You're going to love that conversation. I know I learned a lot from Jim. I always do talking to him. So watch out for that episode, and we will talk to you next time.